When water meets fire. Kira Valdez had perfected the art of invisibility at Jefferson High School. With her slight frame, oversized hoodies, and habit of keeping her dark hair pulled forward to hide her face, she moved through the crowded hallways like a shadow. Her olive skin bore the subtle marks of someone who spent more time outdoors than most realized, but her classmates saw only what she allowed them to see. A quiet girl who preferred books to people and solitude to social gatherings. What they didn't know was that Kira had been training in mixed martial arts since she was 8 years old. Her father, a former Marine, had insisted on it after they moved from base to base throughout her childhood. The discipline, the control, the raw power that flowed through her compact frame. None of that showed when she hunched her shoulders and avoided eye contact in the school corridors. Jefferson High was just another stop in what felt like an endless series of schools. Located in suburban Denver, the brick building housed nearly 2,000 students, and Kira had been there for 3 months without making a single friend. She preferred it that way, or at least that's what she told herself every morning as she navigated the maze of lockers and classrooms. The trouble started in the cafeteria on a Tuesday in October. Kira sat alone at a corner table, working on calculus homework while picking at a sandwich. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor where groups of students clustered around their usual tables. "Look what we have here," came a voice dripping with false sweetness. Kira didn't look up, but she felt the presence of 3 figures approaching her table. She recognized the voice. Brittany Castellanos, a tall blonde with perfectly styled hair and a smile that never reached her eyes. Brittany had the kind of confidence that came from knowing she ruled this particular social ecosystem. "I'm talking to you, ghost girl," Brittany said, her voice louder now. A few nearby tables had gone quiet, sensing the shift in atmosphere. Kira slowly raised her head, meeting Brittany's gaze with steady brown eyes. Behind Brittany stood her 2 constant companions, Jessica Walsh, a redhead with freckles and a perpetual smirk, and Madison Torres, whose dark eyes held the cold calculation of someone who enjoyed others' discomfort. "Can I help you?" Kira asked quietly, her voice barely audible above the cafeteria noise. Brittany laughed, the sound sharp and mocking. "Help me? Honey, I don't think there's anything you could possibly help me with. I was just wondering if you actually speak, or if you're as dead inside as you look." The words stung, but Kira had heard worse. She returned her attention to her homework, hoping they would lose interest and move on. Instead, Jessica stepped closer. "She asked you a question," Jessica said, leaning over the table. "Don't you think it's rude to ignore someone when they're trying to be friendly?" "I'm fine, thanks," Kira murmured, still not looking up. Madison reached out and flipped Kira's textbook closed. "We're talking to you. The least you can do is pay attention." For a moment, Kira felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, the muscle memory of countless hours spent training. Her body wanted to react, to defend, to fight back. But she forced herself to take a slow breath, remembering her father's words about choosing battles wisely. These weren't enemies on a battlefield. They were just cruel teenagers looking for entertainment. "I don't want any trouble," Kira said, gathering her books. "Who said anything about trouble?" Brittany asked, blocking Kira's path as she tried to leave. "We just want to get to know you better. You're new here, right? Where did you transfer from?" Kira tried to step around them, but Madison moved to cut off her escape. The 3 girls formed a loose circle around her, and she could feel the attention of nearby students focusing on the scene. "Military brat," Jessica said suddenly, her eyes lighting up with malicious glee. "I bet that's what you are. That explains the weird clothes and why you don't talk to anyone. Daddy's a soldier, so you never stayed anywhere long enough to learn how to make friends." The observation was uncomfortably accurate, and Kira felt her jaw tighten. But she kept her voice level. "Excuse me, I need to get to class." This time they let her go, but their laughter followed her as she hurried toward the exit. She could hear Brittany's voice carrying across the cafeteria. Poor little army girl, all alone in the world. The pattern was established that day. In the weeks that followed, the three girls seemed to have made Kira their personal project. They would appear at her locker between classes, making loud comments about her clothes or her appearance. They would sit behind her in the classes they shared, whispering just loud enough for her to hear their cruel observations. In chemistry class, where Kira actually enjoyed the logical precision of equations and reactions, they would accidentally knock over her supplies or steal her lab notes. Ms. Rodriguez, the chemistry teacher, was well-meaning but overwhelmed with a class of 30 students and never seemed to notice the subtle harassment. The library became Kira's refuge during lunch and free periods. Among the stacks of books and the hushed whispers of serious students, she could almost forget about the daily humiliations. It was there that she first noticed Derek Martinez, a quiet boy with kind eyes who always sat at the same table in the biography section. Derek was tall and lanky, with dark hair that constantly fell into his eyes and a shy smile that he shared with the librarians when checking out books. He played guitar in the school jazz ensemble, and Kira had seen him carrying his case through the hallways. There was something gentle about him that appealed to her, a quietness that matched her own. One afternoon in November, she found the courage to approach his table. "Mind if I sit here?" she asked, gesturing to the empty chair across from him. Derek looked up from his book, a biography of Miles Davis, and nodded. "Of course, I'm Derek. Kira." They didn't talk much that first day, but the comfortable silence they shared felt like a small victory. Over the following weeks, they began to exchange quiet conversations about books and music. Derek had a dry sense of humor that caught Kira off guard, making her smile despite herself. "You know," he said one day, closing his book and looking at her thoughtfully, "I've seen those girls bothering you, Brittany and her crew." Kira's cheeks reddened. She had hoped her humiliation wasn't quite so visible to the rest of the school. "It's not a big deal." "It kind of is, though," Derek said gently. "They do it because they think you won't fight back." "I don't want to fight," Kira said, and it was mostly true. Fighting meant risking everything her father had taught her about control and discipline. It meant potentially hurting someone badly, and she wasn't sure she could live with that. "Sometimes not fighting is fighting," Derek said cryptically, then smiled. "Sorry, that probably doesn't make sense. I read too much philosophy." But his words stayed with her as the harassment escalated. Brittany and her friends seemed to sense that they had found the perfect victim, someone who would absorb their cruelty without retaliation. They grew bolder, their comments louder and more public. In PE class, they would forget to pass her the ball during volleyball games. In English, they would snicker when she was called on to read aloud. In the hallways, they would bump into her hard enough to send her books scattering across the floor. The breaking point came on a grey December morning during second period chemistry. Ms. Rodriguez had assigned a lab experiment involving acid-base reactions, and students were working in pairs at the black-topped lab tables. Kira had been paired with a quiet girl named Samantha, and they were carefully measuring solutions when Brittany's voice cut through the classroom chatter. "Hey, army girl," Brittany called from across the room. "My beaker's dirty. Think you could clean it for me? You're probably used to that kind of work." Kira kept her eyes on her work, pretending not to hear. But Brittany wasn't finished. "I'm talking to you," Brittany said, her voice rising. Several students turned to watch. "Or are you deaf as well as mute?" Ms. Rodriguez looked up from her desk, frowning. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Brittany said sweetly. "I was just asking Kira if she could help me with something." The teacher's attention returned to her grading, and Brittany's expression hardened. She whispered something to Jessica and Madison, who nodded with matching grins. What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. Jessica approached Kira's lab table, carrying a large beaker filled with water. "Oops," she said, not sounding sorry at all as she tripped and sent the contents splashing directly onto Kira. The cold water soaked through Kira's sweater and jeans, leaving her dripping and stunned. Gasps echoed around the classroom, followed by muffled laughter from Brittany's corner. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," Jessica said loudly, her voice carrying obvious insincerity. "How clumsy of me." Kira stood frozen, water dripping from her hair and clothes, her face burning with humiliation. The entire class was staring now, some with sympathy, others with amusement. Ms. Rodriguez hurried over with paper towels, fussing and apologizing as if it had been a genuine accident. "You should go to the nurse's office and get some dry clothes," the teacher said, pressing towels into Kira's hands. But Kira wasn't moving. Something had shifted inside her, like a dam finally giving way to pressure that had been building for months. The cold water seemed to have washed away her last reserves of patience and self-control. She turned slowly to face Jessica, who was still standing there with the empty beaker, her expression a mixture of satisfaction and barely contained laughter. Beyond her, Brittany and Madison watched with cruel anticipation, waiting to see how their victim would react to this latest humiliation. "Did you just throw water on me?" Kira asked quietly, her voice carrying a new edge that several students noticed. Jessica's smirk faltered slightly. "It was an accident. I already apologized." "No," Kira said, taking a step forward. Water squelched in her sneakers. "It wasn't." The classroom had gone completely silent. Even Ms. Rodriguez stopped fussing with the paper towels, sensing the change in atmosphere. Kira's entire posture had transformed. Where moments before she had been hunched and defensive, now she stood straight, her shoulders back, her chin raised. Her wet hair was slicked back from her face, revealing the full intensity of her dark eyes. "You think this is funny?" Kira asked, her voice still quiet but carrying clearly across the room. "I think you need to calm down," Brittany said, stepping forward to support her friend. But there was something uncertain in her voice now, as if she was seeing Kira clearly for the first time. "I am calm," Kira said, and it was true. The rage that had been building inside her for months had crystallized into something cold and focused. "I'm probably the calmest I've been in a long time." She moved toward Jessica with fluid, predatory grace that made several students step back involuntarily. Jessica raised her hands defensively, the empty beaker slipping from her fingers to shatter on the floor. "Whoa, psycho," Madison said, trying to inject mockery into her voice. "It's just water. Chill out." Kira's head turned toward Madison with mechanical precision. "Just water?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, students were pulling out phones, sensing that something significant was about to happen. "Kira," Ms. Rodriguez said nervously, "perhaps we should all just calm down and—" "I'm tired of being calm," Kira interrupted, never taking her eyes off the three girls. "I'm tired of walking away. I'm tired of pretending this is okay." Brittany stepped between Jessica and Kira, her usual confidence wavering but not quite broken. "Look, Army girl, if you can't take a joke—" She never finished the sentence. Kira's right hand shot out in a lightning-fast jab that caught Brittany square in the solar plexus. The taller girl doubled over, gasping, as Kira flowed into a perfect fighting stance that spoke of years of training and discipline. The classroom erupted in shouts and screams. Madison lunged forward, trying to grab Kira from behind, but found herself caught in an arm lock that sent her sprawling to the floor. Jessica backed against a lab table, her eyes wide with sudden fear. "You want to see what army training looks like?" Kira asked, her voice carrying over the chaos. "This is what it looks like." Brittany straightened up, her face red with pain and fury. "You crazy be—" Kira's legs swept Brittany's feet out from under her before she could finish the insult. The blonde hit the floor hard, her carefully styled hair falling across her face as she struggled to get back up. "Stay down," Kira advised, standing over her with perfect balance and control. Around them, students pressed against the walls, giving the fight a wide berth. Some were recording with their phones, but most just stared in shock at the transformation of the quiet girl they had barely noticed. Madison tried to get up, and Kira helped her along with a perfectly executed hip toss that sent her tumbling into a pile of empty cardboard boxes. The sound of her impact echoed through the room. Ms. Rodriguez was shouting for security, but Kira barely heard her. For the first time in months, she felt completely in control. Every movement was precise, every technique perfectly executed. This was what her training had prepared her for. Not bullies in a high school chemistry lab, but the principle was the same. Stand your ground. Protect yourself. Never let anyone make you feel small. Jessica tried to slip toward the door, but Kira intercepted her with 2 quick steps. "Where are you going?" she asked conversationally. "I don't want any trouble," Jessica stammered, echoing the words Kira had used so many times. "Too late for that," Kira said. She grabbed Jessica's wrist and twisted it into a control hold that brought the girl to her knees. "You should have thought about that before you decided to humiliate me." Brittany was getting back to her feet, her face a mask of rage and disbelief. "You think you're tough? You think this changes anything?" "I know it does," Kira replied calmly. She released Jessica, who scrambled away toward the door. Brittany charged forward with all the grace of an angry rhinoceros, her hands extended to grab at Kira's hair. Kira sidestepped easily, caught Brittany's wrist, and used the girl's own momentum to send her crashing into a lab table. Beakers and test tubes went flying, creating a symphony of breaking glass. The door burst open and 2 security guards rushed in, followed by Principal Davidson and what looked like half the school's administrative staff. But by then, the fight was essentially over. Brittany sat among the wreckage of the lab table, tears of fury streaming down her face. Madison was still trying to untangle herself from the cardboard boxes. Jessica had pressed herself against the far wall, cradling her wrist. And in the center of it all stood Kira, still dripping wet, but no longer looking like a victim. Her breathing was steady, her stance balanced and ready. When she looked around the room, students met her gaze with something they had never shown her before: respect. "Miss Valdez," Principal Davidson said carefully, "I think you need to come with me." Kira nodded and walked toward the door with her head held high. As she passed Derek Martinez, who had somehow appeared in the doorway with a crowd of other students, she saw him nod approvingly. "That," he said quietly, just loud enough for her to hear, "was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." The next few hours were a blur of meetings with administrators, phone calls to her father, and paperwork that seemed designed to make her regret her actions. But Kira felt no regret, only a sense of lightness she hadn't experienced in months. Her father arrived at the school that afternoon, still wearing his military fatigues from the base where he worked as a training instructor. Colonel Marcus Valdez was a compact, serious man who spoke in measured tones and commanded respect without raising his voice. "Tell me what happened," he said once they were alone in Principal Davidson's office. Kira told him everything: the months of harassment, the escalating cruelty, the water incident that had finally pushed her over the edge. Her father listened without interruption, his expression giving nothing away. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to Principal Davidson, who had been shifting uncomfortably in his chair throughout the recitation. "So you're telling me that my daughter endured months of systematic harassment, and the school did nothing to protect her?" "Well, Mr. Valdez," the principal began, "these situations are often more complex than they appear." "There's nothing complex about it," Colonel Valdez interrupted. 3 students targeted my daughter for months. Your staff failed to intervene. When she finally defended herself, you want to punish her for it." The meeting ended with a 3-day suspension for Kira and similar punishments for Brittany, Jessica, and Madison. But as she walked out of the school that afternoon, Kira couldn't bring herself to see it as a loss. When she returned to Jefferson High the following week, everything had changed. Students who had never acknowledged her existence before nodded respectfully in the hallways. The story of the chemistry lab fight had spread through the school like wildfire, growing in the telling until it became the stuff of legend. Brittany and her friends kept their distance. Their reign of casual cruelty effectively ended. When they did cross paths with Kira, there was no more mockery or sneering superiority. If anything, they seemed to go out of their way to avoid her attention. But the most significant change was in Kira herself. She no longer hunched her shoulders or hid behind her hair. She made eye contact when people spoke to her. She raised her hand in class when she knew the answer. Derek found her in the library the day after her return, carrying 2 cups of coffee from the vending machine. "Thought you might need this," he said, setting one in front of her. "Thanks," she said, accepting the gesture gratefully. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, reading their respective books. Finally, Derek looked up and grinned. "You know, I've been thinking about what happened," he said. "Oh." "I think maybe sometimes fighting is the only way to stop fighting." Kira considered this. "My dad always taught me that violence should be a last resort, but he also taught me that everyone has the right to defend themselves. Do you regret it?" The question hung between them for a moment. Kira thought about the months of humiliation, the constant anxiety, the way she had allowed herself to become invisible. Then she thought about walking through the halls with her head up, about the respect she saw in people's eyes, about the satisfaction of standing up for herself. "No," she said finally, "I don't regret it at all." A few weeks later, as winter break approached, Kira was surprised to find Brittany waiting by her locker after school. The blonde girl looked different somehow, smaller, less sure of herself. "Can I talk to you?" Brittany asked quietly. Kira studied her former tormentor with cautious eyes. "What about—" "I wanted to apologize," Brittany said, the words coming out in a rush. "For everything. For the way we treated you. It was wrong." The apology hung in the air between them. Kira could have been cruel, could have thrown it back in Brittany's face with interest. Instead, she nodded. "Apology accepted," she said simply. "I don't expect us to be friends or anything," Brittany continued. I needed you to know that I know it was wrong." After Brittany walked away, Kira stood at her locker for a moment, reflecting on how much had changed. She thought about the girl who had started the school year invisible and afraid, and she barely recognized her. She had learned that sometimes the greatest strength came not from avoiding conflict, but from standing up when it mattered. She had learned that respect had to be earned, sometimes through actions rather than words. Most importantly, she had learned that she didn't have to choose between being strong and being good. As she walked out of Jefferson High that afternoon, with Derek Martinez beside her and her head held high, Kira Valdez knew that she would never be invisible again, and that was exactly how she wanted it.